So in his 2011 National Press Club address, launching his review of Australian climate change policy, the normally understated Professor Ross Garnaut reminded his audience of an obvious but oft-forgotten fact. Australia, he said, is not a pissant country. Despite having less than 1/3 of 1% of the world's population, Australians have built a sophisticated service-based economy, the world's 13th largest by GDP, granting us a seat on the G20 and enabling Australians to enjoy among the highest living standards in the world. Australian scientists have won no fewer than 12 Nobel Prizes for inventions and discoveries, including penicillin and the bionic ear. From world-class symphony orchestras to pop sensations, from Indigenous artists to Hollywood megastars, we're also proud that our cultural exports have such an impact on the international stage. And with the possible exceptions of ping pong and sumo wrestling, there is not a sport in the world in which we do not fancy ourselves among the world's best. In international politics and diplomacy too, we punch well above our weight. Or at least, we used to. In the late 20th century, Australia enjoyed a global reputation as a creative, determined and effective leader in global and regional affairs. Australia led the way in arms control and nuclear non-proliferation, securing regional nuclear test ban treaties and brokering global agreement on a chemical weapons convention. Australia was also pivotal in establishing the Cambodia Peace Plan, and we led the world to ban mining in Antarctica, securing a 50-year moratorium and world's best environmental protection regime for the icy continent. In the 21st century, the problems we face are immense, complex and urgent, and they will require this kind of bold political leadership. In the report that I'm launching today, we argue that Australia has the power to lead the world to zero carbon prosperity. In particular, we argue that Australia is one of only a handful of nations that has the influence and the capabilities necessary to steer the world away from breakneck growth in fossil fuels and toward a world in which people everywhere have access to energy that is affordable, abundant, clean and safe. Tonight, I will explain where that influence comes from, what those capabilities are, and I'll set out the most important steps that Australia should take to realise this vision. But before we get to our proposed destination, we need first to understand where we are now. We need to understand the current state of play in climate change, both the problem and the solutions, and Australia's role in both. Now, all of the world's leaders have endorsed the goal of restricting global average temperature increases to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Achieving this goal is something that the vast majority of Australians support, and with good reason. The scientific consensus is that allowing average temperatures to rise beyond 2 degrees would make the climate system dangerously unstable, with a high risk of irreversible warming and catastrophic impacts for Australia and the world. And now, of course, there's a big debate about whether even 2 degrees is too risky, a debate in the scientific community, and probably is too risky. And so I wanted to acknowledge that, but note that most of the modelling that we draw on, that everyone draws on, has been done around 2 degrees. And so I'll be using that as a reference point tonight. Now, based on the 2-degree goal, the consensus is that if we're to have a likely chance of staying under 2 degrees warming, humanity can emit no more than 1 trillion tonnes of carbon dioxide in the first half of the 21st century. So in other words, we have a 50-year carbon budget of 1,000 billion tonnes. Now the purple pathway on this graph represents the range of temperature increases that are probable this century if we stay within the trillion-tonne budget. And the red pathway shows the range of possibilities associated with business as usual. Now, it's important to understand that we've already burnt through almost half of the trillion-tonne budget in the first 12 years of this century, and emissions are still rising, of course. Our current predicament that the chief economist at the International Energy Agency warned earlier this year that the door to a 2-degree trajectory is about to close. Now, getting through that door and onto a 2-degree trajectory requires that global emissions peak by 2020 at the absolute latest and then begin to decline. You'll see from this graph that the later emissions peak, the faster they need to decline to zero in order to stay within the trillion-tonne budget. So you can see from the blue line that if emissions peak in 2015, then we have to nearly 2050 to decline to zero. If we wait until 2020, the red line, emissions would need to decline at the improbable rate of 9% per year, reaching zero in 2040 to stay within the budget. Now what this graph shows is that all roads from 2 degrees warming lead back to the present decade. And that's why it's referred to, including by the Australian government, as the critical decade. Put simply, the decisions we make in this critical decade will determine the conditions in which humanity must live from now on. So what's the international community doing about all of this? Well, in the report, we talk about the current paradigm, by which we simply mean the mainstream way of thinking about the problem and its solutions. So the international community is trying to solve climate change within a paradigm that we refer to as treaties, targets, and trading. The basic idea is that the governments of all 193 countries get together and try to agree on a grand bargain to solve climate change. Under an ideal treaty, each country would have a target for reducing emissions within its borders to be met by a particular time frame. And all of those individual country targets would then add up to global cuts that equate to the 2-degree budget. And then countries would be able to trade their remaining entitlements among one another, so that those countries that achieve their targets more easily can trade their entitlements with those countries that have greater difficulty in reaching their targets. So what's been achieved within the treaties, targets and trading paradigm? Well, since 1992, when negotiations began, we've had 20 years of summits, 2 treaties, many roadmaps and action plans, thousands and thousands of pages of decisions full of mind-numbing detail, arcane language and extraordinary complexity. But in that time, global emissions have soared, and global energy emissions have increased 50% since 1992. Now, I know many negotiators, and one here tonight in particular, and I have immense respect for what they're trying to do within, the former negotiator in this case, what they're trying to do within the system. And so many of them work incredibly hard to try and get this ideal treaty regime going. But I think we need to confront some realities. In particular, it's really important that we understand that based on the latest roadmap forged in Durban last year, the best case scenario for a new treaty would be far too little, far too late to get the global peak emissions and the decline in emissions within the critical decade that we need. The best case would see any new agreement starting in 2020 with targets to be met much later. And that's the best case scenario. I would be willing to bet that we won't get such an agreement by then, that if we do, it won't add up to the 2-degree budget, and if we did get a treaty and it did add up to the 2-degree budget, it wouldn't be implemented. Okay, so I'll have more to say about alternative paradigms and cooperation later. But for now, as I said, setting out the problem. So what's Australia's role in all of this within the current paradigm? Well, let's first take a look at Australia's carbon footprint. Now, in the report, we advocate what we call the sphere of influence approach, which basically looks at all of the emissions and emission sources over which a country has control or influence. We're not trying to establish a new accounting regime, we're just trying to get a more accurate picture of those emissions and those sources over which a country has influence. And for this, we advocate counting domestic emissions as well as imported emissions and crucially exported emissions. Now, what I'm going to do now is take you through a series of slides and graphs that show Australia's carbon footprint under the sphere of influence approach, focusing on domestic emissions and export emissions. We haven't done the data for imports, so we're just going to focus on domestic and exported emissions. Okay, so this is Australia's domestic emissions from energy. It's about 400 million tonnes a year. Our total emissions are a little bit higher, about 560 million tonnes when you include all sources and things, but we're just focusing on energy here today. So 400 million tonnes a year. Now, of course, these are just the emissions released within our borders. They don't include our exports. Here's what happens when you include the emissions embodied in the fossil fuels that Australia exports. So, to those 400 million tonnes of domestic emissions, we add 800 million tonnes of export emissions, twice as much. So you get a total of 1.2 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And this, of course, is because Australia is the world's largest coal exporter, exporting more than 1/4 of the world's traded coal. And we're also the world's 4th largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, and we're the fastest growing exporter of liquefied natural gas as well. When you just look at countries' export emissions alone, Australia is the 3rd highest, behind only Saudi Arabia and Russia. So you have the 3 kings. You have Saudi Arabia, the king of oil, Russia, the king of gas, and Australia, the king of coal. But this is only half the story. The biggest issue is the future growth in Australia's exported emissions. We are currently digging coal mines, drilling gas wells, and building pipes and ports at a truly astonishing rate. So this is what is expected to happen to our combined domestic and export energy emissions by 2030. So this is based on Australian government data and projections that will more than double our already enormous exported emissions by 2030, causing a whopping 1.8 billion tonnes per year in export emissions alone, almost 2 times Saudi Arabia's current export emissions from oil. Now you add that to our 400 billion tonnes of domestic emissions, which will stay about the same, energy emissions, and you get a grand total of 2.2 billion tonnes of emissions per year. So let's now put these figures in an international context and in the context of the carbon budget. So this is just our domestic energy emissions, that first graph I showed you, the 400 million tonnes. And these are the world's top 20 emissions. I'm looking mainly here at the fat columns, the skinny columns at per capita emissions, but I'm not going to focus on those. So these are the world's top 20 highest emitting countries. And Australia is 15th in terms of energy emissions, with 1.5% of the world's total. Now here's what happens when you recut the data so that it includes domestic emissions and exported emissions. And for the technically minded people in the room, we have netted out imports, so there's no double counting here. So these are the top 20 emitters, and we jump to 6th, causing 4% of the world's emissions when you look at domestic and exports combined. And then if you factor in our 2030 export emissions, we grow even further. Now we've shaded out the other countries here because we haven't done the forward projections to 2030 for all of the other countries' domestic and export emissions. But you can look here and it still puts it in context. You see that compared to other countries' current domestic and export emissions, Australia in 2030 would be emitting or causing more emissions than all but 3 countries, the US, China and Russia. Now, to give you a sense of what this would mean for the 2-degree safe carbon budget in 2030, if we just quickly return to this graph, you'll see that where the paths cross there in 2030, that the safe carbon budget is about 20 gigatons. Now in this next graph, the larger light blue circle represents this 20 gigaton safe carbon budget for 2030, and the dark circle represents Australia's combined domestic and export emissions in 2030. So you see that Australia, with 0.3% of the world's population, has direct control over 11% of the world's safe carbon budget emissions in 2030.